and he said at the beginning of the book, and he says, "Dear Pat, you came upon me carving some kind of little figure out of wood, and you said, 'Why don't you make something for me?' I asked you what you wanted, and you said, 'A box.' What for?" "To put things in." "What things?" "Whatever you have," you said. "Well, here's your box. Nearly everything I have is in it, and it is not full. Pain and excitement are in it, and feeling good or bad, and evil thoughts and good thoughts, the pleasure of design, and some despair, and the indescribable joy of creation. And on top of these are all the gratitude and love I have for you. And still the box is not full." John. Hello and welcome to Raise a Glass, the podcast where we discuss the stories and storytellers that shape us. I am Hunter Danson.
And I am excited for cookies. Sorry. I am Eric Swintola.
How are the cookies?
Yep. They taste about as good as sugar cookies with bunnies on them could taste.
Oh, all right.
You want to try?
Yeah.
Oh.
What are we pairing with these bunny cookies?
You know, the thing that tastes best with sugar cookies has always been wine. So we have a Damiani Wine Cellars MC Squared Finger Lakes red wine. It is MC Squared stands for Merlot, Cabernet Franc, and Cabernet Sauvignon. It's a obviously a blended wine from Damiani Wine Cellars, which I think is located on Seneca Lake, so part of the Finger Lakes region, close to where we are. I actually was just reflecting. The first time I could hand you something and it actually went into your hand. It didn't hit
tap glass.
It didn't hit a screen. Well, it took the oven 25 minutes to preheat, and so I wasn't sure if these would be done, but I don't think I'd want them any more baked.
Yeah, no. I like a little crunch in a sugar cookie, but I don't want it to crunch all the way through.
Yeah. But, here. Now I finished our sugar cookie. Let's have some wine. That's actually not a bad pairing.
No, it's not.
That would be weird together. Let me get you a plate so that way I don't have to hand you all of them.
That's good wine. I think you could pair that with about anything.
That's true. Is 6 okay?
Sure.
Here you go.
No one else.
They're small cookies.
No one else is going to eat them. So what are you raising and pouring out your MC Squared for?
Well, I guess I'll raise it. I've been able to spend most of the day with this cool guy. He's wearing the same hoodie as me.
Shucks.
I think this has actually been it's been an enjoyable day. So we've been planning this trip for a while, but planning it for a while and then also not sure what would happen. And we've done 2 episodes in one day before. Online. We're doing our 3rd now in one day. And I'm enjoying it. I'm having fun. And maybe I'll pour one out for you making me aware that we have podcast voices. So I guess I'd rather my podcast voice be like my normal voice. And so
yeah,
I guess I'm pouring one out for that.
I do so much listening when I'm editing, so I notice it in myself.
Okay.
The podcast voice.
The podcast voice.
Yeah.
Hunter, what are you raising and pouring?
I'm raising one to you for getting the food for us. You did a good job. We had a good dinner. Had Thai. And I guess also Aldi for supplying food. And these bunny cookies, they're pretty good. And you made some great choices for what's in our glass as well. So
Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. And I am pouring one out. For how long the oven took to preheat when you're making these cookies. It was a long wait. Mm-hmm. But it was worth it, I think.
Yeah. It's not too often I eat cookies that I didn't bake or that somebody that I know didn't like make and bake themselves. So East of Eden, Hunter.
East of Eden. This is the first part of our East of Eden.
Yeah, first of what? 4 parts I think we're doing?
Yeah, I think, we're doing roughly 100 pages each time as our goal. And the first part is like 110 pages. In the editions that we have, I highly recommend the Centennial editions. You can get them used for like less than $5. But they're just really nice paperbacks. And
they are.
The pages feel nice. It's just a wonderful reading experience.
Paperbacks with the ruffled pages on the end. So it kind of makes it feel like it's worn and it's real.
Yeah.
In a way that sometimes, books don't feel that same.
I try to collect the Centennials.
Yeah. So why is this a Centennial version? Is it a Centennial of when he was born? Because this book was written in 1952. So it has not been 100 years since this book was written. But it must have been... Okay, it was from when he was born. So it was released in 2002. Hence, you can find them for under $5 at this point.
Yeah. Abe Books is a great site to look for stuff. For books. But East of Eden is a book that I think introduced me to the other side of Steinbeck. Because I think a lot of people read Steinbeck in high school. They read Grapes of Wrath or Of Mice and Men. And they think, man, who is this guy who keeps punching me in the gut?
Right?
But there's another side of Steinbeck. And East of Eden is so much fun to read. You start reading it and you can't put it down. It's funny. Steinbeck is incredibly sarcastic, which if you read Charles with Charlie, you will get a full, heavy dose of. But I think East of Eden was the first of his fiction that I read, and I realized that, Steinbeck has a whole nother side to him. And, East of Eden, I think arguably kind of melds the two sides. It's one of his last books that he wrote, and he really achieves a vision, and that is just really impressive. And I'm always impressed when he's one of my favorite writers to learn from, to learn style and technique, the way that he crafts his sentences, the way that he is able to flow between random opinions in a really engrossing and dramatic scene to moments spanning, decades. Yeah. It's just, it is so hard to do if you try and write fiction, that those transitions are so difficult. And Steinbeck achieves them, seemingly effortlessly in this book. I'm sure he did a lot of editing and things to do it, and lots of practice, of course. But so it's just a really well-written book. It has a really beautiful message, and it's a joy to read for me.
So when you recommended this book, Hunter, I had read Travels with Charlie. Right, we did an episode where we talked about it. But prior to that, I was the kid that, as somebody who loves to read, I remember being forced to read Of Mice and Men and Grapes of Wrath, and disliking, if not despising, both of them. I remember falling asleep while reading Grapes of Wrath over the summer vacation. I'd wake up at like 11, read it, and fall asleep by 11:15. And so that was like feeling a little bit of trepidation diving into this book. But I knew that you had a great experience with it. And my friend Tim, who's listened to many of our episodes, also quite enjoyed it. And I couldn't put it down. He like reiterated something you said. Like, I started and then I just kept reading. So I started this one probably in August or September. So back before baby number 2 was born for me, when I thought we'd kind of dive right into that first part. And so, and I made it through the first like 27 chapters. For context, the first part of this book is the first 11 chapters. And so, but it's been a while. So I actually today, as I was heading over here, kind of re-listened to the first part of the book. And the first part is probably the most depressing part, at least as far as what I've read through. I don't. Well, maybe not. I don't know. It's you're just introduced to the characters and you start diving into them, but you don't get like the real depth of some of the characters I think are the coolest characters.
Yeah.
But I'm actually really, really excited about this, and so I want to kind of reiterate your statement of like it's actually worth reading even if you don't like the other Steinbeck that you've been introduced to. It still has some of the depressing pieces because Steinbeck writes about life at a hard time. But it is also full of really complex characters and really fascinating relationships. And like, I'm like reading them, I'm like, okay, like how are these two characters going to interact? Like, when's it going to happen? What's it going to look like? And like, when it does happen, it doesn't look like what I expected.
Yeah.
And can you give us a little bit of do you know a lot of the background of this book? Or just from what you've read in the beginning of this thing?
I mean, not a whole lot. So I know that in his journal, Steinbeck called it the first book, and it's kind of like it's titled East of Eden, which is a biblical reference to when man is cast out of Eden and they are east of Eden in Genesis, but it's based on the story of Cain and Abel from Genesis as well, and but it is also it's inspired by John Steinbeck's family. So like Sam Hamilton is John Steinbeck's grandfather.
Is it okay? So he mentions in this his mother is Olive Hamilton, and so I wasn't sure how much of it was actually based off. Sorry.
Yeah. So I am not sure how much is 100.
Yeah.
It's probably not 100% true. It's probably heavily dramatized, but I think there is a lot of truth. I don't know. Steinbeck is the type of guy that I feel like he's not going to try and he's a pretty honest writer. Sometimes almost to a fault. But yeah, so it's kind of like a mesh. It's kind of like a combination of this retelling of Cain and Abel in a modern age, two brothers, and then there's another set of brothers who kind of enact the Cain and Abel story as well. And if you're not familiar with Cain and Abel, it's the first murder. Cain and Abel are sons of Adam and Eve, and Cain ends up killing Abel because God favors Abel's sacrifice, and Cain is jealous. And it's that. So Steinbeck kind of takes that story of like brotherly aggression and jealousy
and
love, yeah, and tells a story about his family at the same time.
Well, it's not that too far. Yeah, we only did the first part.
That's true.
And like, there's already things you're telling me that I'm like a little bit wary of, like them giving spoilers, even though I've read.
Yeah, you're right.
Almost 300 pages.
Yeah, so we're doing the first 110 pages in this episode. I'm not sure how we're going to structure it. Like,
do you want to give a summary of what happens in here, or would you like me to?
I think you should.
Okay. So the first 100 pages or so follows the story of primarily two characters. The first is a guy named Adam Trask. Mm-hmm. Adam has a hard life. His mother died of suicide when he was very young. His father was part of the military and raised Adam and his younger half-brother, Charlie, as like military guys. And then Adam's stepmom also dies while he's in the military. So Adam ends up in the military, which is the opposite of his entire personality. His younger brother, half-brother, is he beats him up regularly as a kid. They have a hard relationship, but also a beautiful relationship at times. His younger brother is continually angry at him for years and years and years of his life because their dad loved him more. He goes on regularly about how their dad loved Adam's dog that he gave him, mongrel dog, but hated, never even used or sharpened the knife that Charlie spent 6 bits to get. So it follows Adam's story, and he ends up, after he's in the military, kind of going through and becoming a tramp for a while, and he's picked up on does another tour shortly after. All of this is happening a few decades after the Civil War. And they live in, Connecticut, I think? Connecticut area, on a farm. And so while his story is going on, there's also the story of a woman named Kathy Ames. And she is... she is a character that never feels like any real emotion. She's almost somebody who's enacting being a person rather than being a person from a very young age. And so we are also following her story as she manipulates, often through lust, the people around her, including, and then also kills them, including a teacher, her parents. Not every aspect of what I'm saying applies to everybody that she interacts with. But then a man who runs a business of whores. And like I said, the first part of this book is kind of intense and not the most exciting. And then it ends up with the two of them, Adam and his brother Charlie, taking in Kathy after she's beaten almost to death. Into their house, and then her beginning to manipulate the two of them. And so that's how I would kind of share. There's some characters along the way who I haven't mentioned. The main character I think that I would care about is Sam Hamilton, who I think is the greatest character in this book, at least through what I've read. But those are some of the main pieces that I would hit. Are there things that you want to highlight for a synopsis?
No, I think that's good. I think the real joy of East of Eden is not necessarily just the plot points, even though it is a good plot, but just the words.
Oh yeah. And so yes, so that's. I think if somebody were to tell me the summary that I just gave, I wouldn't be interested in reading this. But I have now read through at least this part of it twice. And I find it really fascinating. And I'll also say part of the reason I find it so fascinating is because I know a lot of what comes next. And I'm excited for what's coming next. But Hunter, we've now described a little bit more of the book. We're obviously going to get into discussing some of it. But I'd like to do that by means of you sharing a little bit more about how it shaped you, and if there's specific character or specific quotes, we can then kind of use that to launch into some of our discussion.
Yeah. It's definitely a book that is an inspiration to me as a writer. Steinbeck's prose is excellent, and it's funny. It's hard to like talk about prose because you have to use lots of examples to really communicate what you mean. And hopefully we can give some examples soon. There are lots of moments in this book that I think about a lot. I think about Adam's father a lot, in the way that he was not even in the war, and then he ends up being in the president's war cabinet because he tells lies about all the wars that he was in, and how he was, is very knowledgeable about the battles, and just by like pure hubris, he is able to, be this big politician. And so I think about that quite a lot, especially in our political climate today and types of people that become politicians. Not all of them are like Adam Trask, but I think what is needed to succeed at politics is the hubris.
Cal Trask.
Who was it? Not Adam Trask, yeah.
Private Trask.
Private
Cal?
Trask.
Is his name Cal?
Adam's father.
Yeah, no, it's not Cal.
And of course, the character of Sam Hamilton is just a beautiful character. One of the most beautiful characters that I've ever encountered in a book. Steinbeck talks about the music of his voice, the way that he built his house with his own hands, and
I found the quote. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, this is for the Cyrus Trask.
Cyrus Trask, yes.
You were talking about the prose and about Cyrus Trask as a character. He was in the Civil War, for only a few months. He got shot in his first battle and lost his leg. And here's kind of what is written about him, about his, The youth, inexperience, and taciturnity of Alice Trask all turned out to be assets for Cyrus. That's his new wife. Cyrus, while he continued to operate his farm as such farms were operated in the neighborhood, he entered on a new career, that of the old soldier. And that energy which had made him wild now made him thoughtful. No one outside of the War Department knew the quality and duration of his service. His wooden leg was at once a certificate of proof of his soldiering and a guarantee that he wouldn't ever have to do it again. Timidly, he began to tell Alice about his campaigns, but as his technique grew, so did his battles. At the very first, he knew he was lying, but it was not long before he was equally sure that every one of his stories was true. Before he had entered the service, he had not been much interested in warfare. Now he bought every book about war, read every report, subscribed to the New York papers, studied maps. His knowledge of geography had been shaky, and his information about the fighting non-existent. Now he became an authority. He knew not only the battles, movements, campaigns, but also the units involved, down to the regiments, their colonels, and where they originated. And from telling, he became convinced that he had been there. All of this was a gradual development, and it took place while Adam was growing to boyhood and his young half-brother behind him. And he continues on, and it's this, you were talking about him, Cyrus ending up being in the war cabinet for the president. And these cup threes, 3 or 4 paragraphs that kind of talk about how it came to be, I think do a really good job of showing his Cyrus's personality. Mm-hmm. Like, he wasn't trying to lie. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, like, he said it enough times that it became truth to him.
Yeah.
And at no point did he ever raise his space in the war above private. And so they even have a whole quote about that. But it's just fascinating to me the way that even that word, that those paragraphs are some of my favorite little bits as far as the juice goes in there. Mm-hmm. And so I just wanted to say that while it's still somewhat relevant.
Yeah.
And you were talking about Sam Hamilton, so we can get to those quotes now if you want.
Yeah.
Maybe while you're finding
this. There is an early line that I would like to address, because this was a line that kind of like I puzzled over when I first read it, and I puzzled over when I read it again. When Steinbeck is talking about the native people of the land.
Yep.
On page 6 of our edition. And he calls them, and I don't know, they're harsh words. He calls them an inferior breed without energy, inventiveness, or culture, a people that lived on grubs and grasshoppers and shellfish, too lazy to hunt or fish. And obviously I don't agree with that and the disrespect. He shows equal disrespect for the Spaniards who come to take the land away. But I think you can see the flaws in authors, and good authors, very skilled authors, and that is one of Steinbeck's blind spots. It's interesting in Travels with Charlie because he writes in a way that is very sympathetic to African Americans, and so I don't know. I puzzled over this section quite a bit, and it's kind of hard to. There's not really a way to justify it, but it doesn't mean that the book's not worth reading. But I think the way that he says it is insulting, but it's also like a kind of set up against American culture, which is very we want to change the land. We don't want to just live with it and take care of it. We want to change it and use it and make money off of it.
I have a question that I think will maybe help dive into this and other pieces further. What voice is the narrator? Whose voice is the narrator in this book? Like, do you think, is it? Oh.
I'm pretty sure it's Steinbeck.
Steinbeck as himself?
Yeah, I mean it's hard to say because it's a fiction book. So even though he talks about his grandfather and his grandmother and their characters connected to him, and he uses I, he uses the first person. There's in any fiction book is not real, even if it seems real. Lots of authors use pen names and makeup authors, and so it's hard to say what is the real Steinbeck and what is
Well,
this Steinbeck?
the reason I ask is because a later point, and I can't find the quote right now, it's talking about Adam when he's in the war and fighting, and how he was one of the best marksmen, but he was actively committing small acts of treason by choosing by purposefully missing when he was firing, quote unquote, at Native Americans. And it makes it very clear that Adam Trask thinks that the war, the fighting against Native Americans was wrong and gross. And so we have an alternative voice in that situation. And so is it purposely pitted against the narrator? No, not quite, but
I mean, and this is also a book whose, one of the best characters is Chinese American character of Lee, which
we don't meet
we
in
don't
the first
meet yet, but we get to meet Lee. But I don't know. I just wanted to acknowledge that line. And I mean, let's face it, Steinbeck is not the one you should go to read about Native people. James Welch, Fool's Crow.
He also writes really poorly about the experience of Adam's mother and her death. And so, it's a hard thing to read. This book it's hard to read, but it's also encouraging along the way because it's not just gloom. And I know we're going to talk about Sam Hamilton in just a moment. And I think it's funny because this whole book is about the Salinas Valley, which is in Northern California. It is a long, narrow swell between two ranges of mountains. The Salinas River winds and twists up the center until it falls at last into Monterey Bay. So it's about 25-mile space that Steinbeck's family grew up in. And yet, in the first part, none of the main set of characters are in the Salinas Valley. The only way we hear about the Salinas Valley is in the intro narrative, scene setting, and then in Sam Hamilton's story. Because Sam Hamilton, I think, ultimately becomes more important as the story goes on.
Yeah.
So, Andrew, you've talked about the prose being a big piece of this book. And you've mentioned Sam Hamilton. Are there passages that stick out to you?
Yeah, I'm looking through my notes here. And this is a little paragraph about the cleanness of Sam Hamilton. It says, Samuel had no equal for soothing hysteria and bringing quiet to a frightened child. It was the sweetness of his tongue and the tenderness of his soul. And just as there was a cleanness about his body, so there was a cleanness in his thinking. Men coming to his blacksmith shop to talk and listen dropped their cursing for a while, not from any kind of restraint, but automatically, as though this were not the place for it. And it's just, on the third sentence here, he starts, and just as there was a cleanness. He starts a sentence with and, which is, you're not supposed to do that. But he does it, and it works. And that's, that's part of the prose. And just, I feel like in the modern popular fiction, they would say, okay, you need to take that paragraph and turn it into several scenes that show the cleanness of Sam's thinking, have actual dialogue and things. But because they tell you one of the rules everyone talks about is show, don't tell. But I think the beauty of Steinbeck and lots of other authors that I love is that they learn how to tell. There has to be a balance because some truths you can't just show them. You have to say something about them. So
I was. It's interesting you say that because I'm a very visual reader, and this whole section on Sam Hamilton and his life, and this whole book, but we're kind of talking about this right now. Like, it makes it so easy for me to visualize.
Yeah.
And I guess when I visualize, sometimes I visualize scenes. But another way that I kind of quote unquote visualize in my brain is with like senses and like moods and like takeaways, like almost like the taste on your tongue at the end. Like, is it a bitter? Is a person bitter? Like, I feel that way.
Yeah.
If I read a really hard part of a book and then I try to have like a loving conversation with my kid, it's very hard for me. And I think that I was able. I mean, this section, I was really able to visualize it. And you also do a disservice because you gave a quote that comes at the end of a large set of examples and small stories of where he already proved the cleanness of heart and of mind and of tongue. And so it's not just that there's a paragraph where he tells things. He does it after. You don't need this paragraph to take away the same conclusion. Yeah. Almost. About Sam Hamilton. But this paragraph cements it in your brain so that you don't lose this pivotal fact about who he is. Yeah. Because his character is one of the only characters in the book that loves. Yeah. Deeply.
I guess scratch what I said about telling. I think what I was looking more for was kind of like making a poetry out of the story and the examples that he gives before this, because there are many examples, and I think that's the difficulty of a podcast and our society that we live in. We want to be able to give little sound bites and things that give examples, but there's really no substitute for reading a book and experiencing each paragraph in context. Because, part of the experience of reading East of Eden is the flow of it.
Oh, yeah. Wonder, is it safe to say that the first part of this book is the setup for the rest of the book?
More or less, yeah.
Because in this we have the primary character identities of Adam, Charlie, Kathy, Sam. I guess those are the four kind of main pieces, and the way that they are either created by or impacted by or stand in opposition to Cyrus, both Adam and Charlie's mother, Liza Hamilton, Kathy's parents, the man who owned the business that Kathy was almost killed by. A lot of these different, like, you have the origin stories, maybe is what I'm trying to say, behind them, and you have the idea for where they will possibly come together throughout the rest of it.
And yet there's also, some very dramatic and moment by moment scenes between Adam and Charlie as well. There's the scene where Charlie almost kills Adam. And there's one part here where Charles writes Adam a letter.
That's my bad.
And I think this is an example of one of the ways that Steinbeck shows his skill and all the practice that he's put into writing, and the way that he transitions from kind of narrating how Adam went away to the war, what Charles is doing on the farm while Adam is away on the war and in the army, to this letter. And I love, Steinbeck says, during the time Adam was away, he knew his brother better than ever before or afterward. In the exchange of letters, there grew a closeness neither of them could have imagined. Mm. I just love the narration of this. Dear Adam kept one letter from his brother, not because he understood it completely, but because it seemed to have a covered meaning he could not get at. Dear brother Adam, the letter said, I take my pen in hand to hope you are in good health. He always started this way to ease himself gently into the task of writing. I have not had your answer to my last letter, but I presume you have other things to do. Ha ha. The rain came wrong and damned the apple blossoms. There won't be many to eat next winter, but I will save what I can. Tonight I clean the house, and it is wet and soapy, and maybe not any cleaner. How do you suppose Mother kept it the way she did? It does not look the same. Something settles down on it. I don't know what, but it will not scrub off. But I have spread the dirt around more evenly anyways. Ha ha. And then there's more. And then later on, it said, there was a scratch on the page and a splash of ink, and then it went on in pencil, but the writing was different. In pencil it said, later. Well, right there the pen give out. One of the points broke off. I'll have to buy another pen point in the village, rusted right through. The words began to flow more smoothly. I guess I should wait for a new pen point and not write with a pencil. Only I was sitting here in the kitchen with the lamp on, and I guess I got to thinking, and it come on late, after 12, I guess, but I never looked. Old Black Joe started crowing out in the hen house. Then Mother's rocking chair cricked for all the world like she was sitting in it. You know, I don't take truck with that, but it set me minding backwards. You know how you do sometimes. I guess I'll tear this letter up, maybe, because what's the good of writing stuff like this? The words began to race now as though they couldn't get out fast enough. If I'm to throw it away, I'd just as well set it down, the letter said. It's like the whole house was alive and had eyes some everywhere. And like there was people behind the door just ready to come in if you looked away. It kind of makes my skin crawl. I mean, I never understood, well, why our father did it. Why didn't he like that knife I bought for him on his birthday? Why didn't he? It was a good knife, and he needed a good knife. If he had used it or even honed it or took it out of his pocket and looked at it, that's all he had to do. If he'd liked it, I wouldn't have took out after you. I had to take out after you. Seems like to me my mother's chair is rocking a little. It's just the light. I don't take truck any with that. Seems like to me there's something not finished. Seems like when you half finish a job and can't think what it was, something didn't get done. I shouldn't be here. I ought to be wandering around the world instead of sitting here on a good farm looking for a wife. There is something wrong, like it didn't get finished, like it happened too soon and left something out. It's me should be where you are and you here. I never thought like this before, maybe because it's late. It's later than that. I just looked out and it's first dawn. I don't think I fell off to sleep. How could the night go so fast? I can't go to bed now. I couldn't sleep anyways. The letter was not signed. Maybe Charles forgot he had intended to destroy it and sent it along, but Adam saved it for a time, and whenever he read it again it gave him a chill, and he didn't know why.
The best stories give you the space. No. The best stories are best read with other people and discussed. And because I think that as you discuss them with others, you begin to understand them better and understand yourself better and understand the way they impact things more. And the question, but Adam saved it for a time. Whenever he read it, it gave him a chill and he didn't know why. That implied question, like, why did it give him the chill? Like, that can lead to a whole discussion, right? And that's what helps you understand better, not just the relationship between Adam and Charles, but also the way that we interact with the way that we are based off the way our parents interacted with us and the way we interact with our siblings. Because when you're reading that piece, like I remember the first time I got it, I think I might have even gotten a chill at the end of that. And because Charles doesn't communicate that way. Right? Charles only ever communicates that in writing. And actually that's written shortly before this whole passage you just quoted.
Yeah.
And the relationship between Adam and Charles is one of danger. Like Adam at multiple times in their childhood is afraid for his life and almost killed by Charles because of Charles' like envy for towards Adam for their father's love. And an anger that their father loves Adam more, which Adam never said, but which Cyrus, their dad, does tell Adam. And this wouldn't have worked if he had said it to his brother. It needed to be written out. Like, it wouldn't have felt like Charles if it came up in a conversation, unless it came up while he was actively trying to kill his brother. And you can also, I'm not a psychologist. I don't pretend to be. Like, there seem to be at least sociopathic tendencies within Charles and what he does, and like his dad notes it to Adam, like if Charles, he says, if Charles were to be sent to war, like, it would only bring out the worst, the stuff that should be repressed and hidden within him.
Yeah.
Whereas for Adam, it will hopefully bring him to a space of deepest humility and deepest brokenness, so that he can be best built back up as a more full man than he ever was before.
And just from a writing perspective, like, it's just amazing that Steinbeck can communicate so much with a letter that is written by someone who's not a writer.
Interesting.
Because you read it and you can picture Charles sitting alone in his house, hearing his mother's rocking chair, and like writing a letter to his brother and dealing with the jealousy and the violence that is within him. Yeah. And that coming out on a letter is so efficient and so like elegant. And yet it is also, it doesn't feel like Steinbeck is writing. It feels like Charles is writing.
Yeah. Yes.
So it's just an inspiration to me. I just love, just from a technique perspective, what a wonderful way to tell a story. To communicate a moment of vision, which is a term that maybe we'll become more familiar with when we talk about Tess of D'Urbervilles and Thomas Hardy, but like these scenes that are real moments of vision that writers have, and I love it.
Are there other things you want to share about Adam and Charles and their relationship?
I don't know.
Says, well, Adam's at war. His brother Charles tends to the family farm, and that becomes his livelihood.
Yeah.
And I did see a quote on your notes, I think from page 53 about Charles. Because Charles is not a great guy, and
no,
nobody thinks he's a good guy. Charles,
in fact, recognizes Kathy when they meet. Charles is like, "Oh, you're kind of like me,"
yeah.
Which you don't want to be like Kathy.
We'll get to her next. Yeah. But in the midst of all of his brokenness and all of the problems, and he's a good farmer.
Kept one slovenly woman after another.
But he was a great farmer, and for these things, page 53, for these things he kept the respect of his neighbors. A farmer cannot think too much evil of a good farmer. Charles was spending most of his money and all of his energy on the farm.
Yeah.
He didn't know where else to place it, and so that's actually a big fighting point between Adam and Charles when Adam comes back and their dad dies and they receive a massive inheritance. One says that they don't need to work another day in their life, and they keep fighting back and forth, and this whole thing that goes on, and Steinbeck's got some great quotes on that. But it's this idea of Charles says, "No, you got to wake up at." He wakes up the blink before 4:30. He blinks his eye once before 4:30 a.m. every day. And his whole goal is to work on his farm so he makes more money to grow his farm so he can make more money to grow his farm. And Adam's like, what's the point if you don't have people to share with?
Yeah. And he's like, why do we have to work? We're rich. Charles is like, but where did the money come from? Which is interesting because, Adam is the more sympathetic of the men. And yet Charles, he smells something wrong with the money that his father gives them, because his father's position did not have that high of a salary, so he's very suspicious of, the money that is the ill-gotten gains.
Harken back to the Dominion episode. You don't like ill-gotten gains, do you? It's in prosperity, isn't it?
No, it's in
Wait, which one's ill-gotten gains?
Is it Adventures?
No.
Or maybe
Doesn't
doesn't matter.
Do we have to talk about Kathy now?
I mean, we don't have to. There is a quote that I would like to share about Kathy.
Okay.
This is a sentence that I never forgot even after I read this book, and it's the way that that East of Eden has shaped me is I've used this sentence as an example of prose, of prose that I would like to be able to write someday. And that is after Kathy is beaten half to death and she's taken in by Charles, and Charles and Adam, Steinbeck says, for 2 weeks, Kathy lay in a cave of shock and opium. And it is easy enough to read a sentence like that and be like, oh yeah, okay, I know what that's communicating. But it is really hard to come up with it if you're sitting there staring at a blank page. Because, it's one thing to come up with a plot and characters and everything, but to be able to communicate for several days, Kathy lay in a cave of shock and opium. It communicates it so succinctly and so beautifully, and it's I used this analogy in our Tolstoy episode And I said reading Tolstoy is like watching a grandmaster chess game where someone is like narrating the moves to you. You know, chess grandmaster makes a move, and you're like, oh yeah, I see why he did that. I can see that he's trying to block that attack from his opponent. But if you were sitting there on that side of the chessboard, you would not come up with that move, most likely. And that is, Steinbeck has practiced a lot in writing, and this is an example of a sentence that.
Oh yeah, it makes no sense.
Yeah,
well, it makes complete sense. But like, who would use in 5 words? Cave of shock and opium.
I don't know.
Cave, shock, and opium. Use those 3 words in a sentence.
Yeah. It takes a lot of practice and experimentation, and because it's really poetry in prose.
I feel like it's important to read the first couple paragraphs that describe
Okay.
Kathy. Just to understand, again, the way that he creates a character that is pretty unlike any character I've read, because like the actions she makes are always in for her own game and are almost always inhuman, which I think all of us have read characters like that. It might even be a trope of characters at some point. But to have that character be 3-dimensional and be introduced as a 3-dimensional character, I think that's actually a lot harder. So these are the first couple paragraphs that he uses to kind of set up the scene when he then speaks about Kathy. It says, "I believe there are monsters born in the world to human parents. Some you can see, misshapen and horrible, with huge heads or tiny bodies. Some are born with no arms, no legs, some with 3 arms, some with tails or mouths in odd places. They are accidents and no one's fault, as used to be thought. Once they were considered the visible punishments for concealed sins. And just as there are physical monsters, can there not be mental or psychic monsters born? The face and body may be perfect, but if a twisted gene or malformed egg can produce physical monsters, may not the same process produce a malformed soul?" I'm going to keep reading. "Monsters are variations from the accepted normal to a greater or lesser degree. As a child may be born without an arm, so one may be born without kindness or the potential of a conscience. A man who loses his arms in an accident has a great struggle to adjust himself to the lack. But one born without arms suffers only from people who find him strange. Having never had arms, he cannot miss them. Sometimes when we are little, we imagine how it would be to have wings. But there is no reason to suppose it is the same feeling birds have. No, to a monster the norm must seem monstrous, since everyone is normal to himself. To the inner monster it must be even more obscure, since he has no visible thing to compare with others. To a man born without conscience, a soul-stricken man must seem ridiculous. To a criminal, honesty is foolish. You must not forget that a monster is only a variation, and that to a monster the norm is monstrous. It is my belief that Kathy Ames was born with the tendencies, or lack of them, which drove and forced her all of her life." What a cool introduction to a character that I think nobody likes, but is fascinating by simultaneously.
Yeah.
And
And
it describes her.
yeah. And it breaks all of the rules that people tell you to follow when you start writing. Uses the first person, gives extended opinions, personal opinions. Like, I believe that there are monsters. Editor would see that like, why are you saying I believe? You're not in this story. But it just works. He makes it work, and a seamless transition to Kathy Ames in the story.
It reminds me the way what happens here reminds me of Paralandra by C.S. Lewis, which I know I've talked about before, and the specific example, which I know I've talked about, of the main character in Paralandra trying to describe what it's like to see this bulbous caterpillar-like centipede evil thing chase him, and then the thing dies, and his view on it changing it. And he said it's like when he was a professor at university, writing a paper, working on a paper, and this grotesque bug landed on his paper, and it had the grossest angles, and everything about it was hideous. The angles on it, the color, all these pieces. And then he realized that it was a leaf. And then everything that had made the bug ugly made the leaf beautiful. And it was this way of, and the reason these things compare my brain is using things that we understand, visual things we understand, to describe internal realities and switches and thought processes that we can't relate to. And I think that this, in a different way, like communicates in a way that I very rarely am able to read, and definitely am not able to write. Just even trying to communicate what I'm thinking about it is hard. Like trying to then communicate that entire approach, be able to do that is next level.
Yeah. And I don't know. I feel like this wouldn't get published today. I feel like if you tried to query this, it wouldn't get picked up. I don't know.
This wasn't his first book, though.
True.
Right? This is one of his later books. And so it might be that fact that made it, gave it the space to be published.
Yeah. I mean, I think there is a sense of indulgence about East of Eden because it's
huge.
Yeah, it's Steinbeck's, it's his family. It's his silliness valley. But I think that's also what makes it what it is, what makes it unique and engrossing.
If you plan on checking out some of the different parts of this book, and like reading along with us, I cannot recommend the audible version of this more. It is narrated by Richard Poe. It's just he's got a voice like Sam Hamilton. Maybe the best I could say. So, Andrew, you mentioned a little bit earlier about this being a Cain and Abel story. I didn't know that when I started reading it. But I picked it up pretty quickly with Adam and Charles. But there was a moment I was re-listening to today that was like, oh my goodness. It's very obvious, but struck me is when Charles is trying to move the big stone. When Adam's at war, he gets really angry at it in a moment of the specific language doesn't make it. In a moment of absolute hatred, he starts fighting with it like he would a person. And in that moment, the pole snaps back and hits him in the head. And he ends up with this ugly scar that pusses and then ultimately heals up. But unlike most scars that healed lighter, this one heals and it turned brown and it keeps getting darker. And I was thinking about the passage after Cain has killed Abel, where God gives Mark's Cain, sends him away. And Cain says, well, they're going to kill me if you send me away. Like they know what I did. And God says, no, I'm going to mark you so that they won't. And that's what I visualize. the mark that's on Charles's head, and the mark that God gave Cain.
Yeah,
it's definitely not incidental.
Yeah,
that's what happens.
It's there's Bible study in this book later on. And it's amazing. I'm glad that you brought up that example, because I think it's easy to look at books that are based on other things and kind of maybe think less of them because maybe the author didn't have to do as much work or something. But when you read East of Eden, there's no doubt in your mind that you're reading a book by John Steinbeck that he wrote, that he researched, that, and it's almost harder to kind of tell a believable story based on a biblical story that, there's really not a lot of detail in Cain and Abel in the Old Testament. And Steinbeck is able to tell kind of the heart of Cain and Abel, which is this brotherly anger, this jealousy, the desire to kill, the hatred, and also love at the same time, and that contradiction and the brokenness of our ways, in a very human story.
Well, it's by definition a very human story.
Yeah, that's true. I guess I meant in a more like modern story that is, its own story. Even if you know nothing about Cain and Abel, you can still read East of Eden and be immersed.
Yeah.
I think I have one more quote, but we will have much more East of Eden to share. And I hope you read along with us. It is really a great experience.
And if you are reading along with us, please let us know. We'd love to find a way to have an open forum discussion about this.
Yeah.
If possible, for a later episode, maybe even.
Yeah. I am on Twitter and Mastodon at HDanson. I can put links in the description. We're also going to have a Patreon.
Yeah, we will link it once it's out and ready.
Yeah. But this last quote, I think, is just a demonstration of how Steinbeck communicates in vision and how he can immerse you in the story in so few lines. Anyway, this is Adam is sort of he's thinking of asking Kathy to marry him because Adam cannot see Kathy looks very innocent. She's very beautiful. She uses her beauty. And Adam kind of takes pity on her, and he's kind of ready to leave the farm. He doesn't want to live with Charles anymore. And he's got a lot of money. He's ready to go somewhere else. And he sees Kathy as kind of as sent from above, sent from God. Even though she's the opposite. But he's kind of deciding about Kathy right now. Adam stood up and strode out of the room. He went to the back door and looked out on the afternoon. Far off in the field his brother was lifting stones from a sled and piling them on the stone wall. Adam looked up at the sky. A blanket of herring clouds was rolling in from the east. He sighed deeply, and his breath made a tickling, excited feeling in his chest. His ears seemed suddenly clear, so that he heard the chickens cackling and the east wind blowing over the ground. He heard horses' hooves plodding on the road and far off pounding on the wood where a neighbor was shingling a barn, and all these sounds related into a kind of music. His eyes were clear, too. Fences and walls and sheds stood staunchly out in the yellow afternoon, and they were related, too. There was change in everything. A flight of sparrows dropped into the dust and scrabbled for bits of food, and then flew off like a gray scarf twisting in the light. Adam looked back at his brother. He had lost track of time, and he did not know how long he had been standing in the doorway. No time had passed. Charles was struggling with the same large stone, and Adam had not released the full, held breath he had taken when time stopped. Suddenly he knew joy and sorrow felted into one fabric. Courage and fear were one thing, too. He found that he had started to hum a droning little tune. He turned, walked through the kitchen, and stood in the doorway looking at Kathy. She smiled weakly at him, and he thought, what a child, what a helpless child, and a surge of love filled him. Will you marry me? He asked.